That's hard.
And then there was
No, I just forgot it. Someone's like, what party? And I'm like, what party is this?
yeah, Facebook. Gotcha. Well, no, it has issues like and I consider it atheist religion agnostic.
All right. Hello again, everybody. I think we are ready to start now, and we had already built in a 5-minute delay, so we're all good. And welcome everybody here in the room as well as online for joining us for today's Insights to Action seminar series at ICRW. My name is Aslıhan Kes, and I am a senior economist with the Gender, Economic Employment and Livelihoods team here at ICRW. And for us, these seminars are an opportunity to really introduce the evidence and learnings from our own research and bring together experts on those topics and really exchange ideas and lessons learned to inform the practice and inform our research moving forward. And in this spirit today, we've brought together a great group of experts who've been working in the field of energy inclusion, exploring issues around last-mile connectivity, sustained and at-scale solutions to reach the poorest and the most marginalized populations, including women, who live and work without access to reliable, high-quality, and sustained energy sources. So we have with us Rachel Mahmoud. She's a program manager of at the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves, where she oversees the gender work, and where they've been working on integrating women into the clean cookstoves value chains, especially in the marketing and sales at NOS. And we have Stephanie Finnegan from Value for Women. Stephanie is a program manager for gender and social inclusion in business. And Value for Women is currently partnering with Shell Foundation once again to it's a pilot initiative where they're trying to integrate gender in the off-grid electricity value chain, small and medium enterprises. And Tom Coogan from the United States African Development Foundation, where he is the regional director for Anglophone Africa, and where they work on off-grid energy programs, and where he started or helped start the program, and where he oversees the Women in Energy Challenge initiative currently. And finally, Ali Glinsky from ICRW will be talking about our work that we recently concluded, or we are about to conclude, with the Rockefeller Foundation on their Smart Power for Rural Development initiative in India, which is also actually active in East Africa and Myanmar. So I think we're all in this room at least agreed that sustainable energy access has the power to catalyze social and economic development, promote better educated, healthier and more productive and resilient communities. At the same time, we still have a lot to do and many miles to walk to get to the point where we have comprehensive, high-quality energy solutions and inclusive solutions for everybody. Currently, we have more than 1 billion people, mostly in rural areas, still with limited or no access to electricity, and nearly 3 billion people still do not have access to clean fuel for cooking solutions and technologies. And energy inclusion is particularly endemic among the poor and women, who are often more likely to be excluded because they tend to be more income constrained and can have different energy needs and preferences that may not be included in the design and the delivery of these energy solutions. And all these, for example, such as off-grid electricity that's been really taken up and being sort of tested and piloted in different contexts, we see there are still challenges that needs to be addressed, tackled for a comprehensive energy inclusion. We still, while they address some of the issues around geographic reach and quality and reliability, we see that it's not an automatic vehicle for truly inclusive energy access. So today we'll be talking from our experience working with the Rockefeller Foundation in this initiative we talked about, where we focused on where the initiative focuses especially in 2 regions in India, in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, where energy deficits are particularly significant, and where SPRD has been working with Smart Power India and business partners, energy supply companies, to enhance inclusion. and trying to make the case from both a social point of view as well as a business point of view for these different partners. So I'll ask Ali to come and take it from here, and I'll just come back.
Thanks, Asla. Thank you all for coming for holiday parties and holiday breaks. Thanks for making time for us. So as Asla said, I'm going to be talking about a project that we are just coming to the end on with the Rockefeller Foundation, working on energy inclusion in India. The Smart Power for Rural Development initiative was started by Rockefeller in 2015, and as Asla said, is in Sub-Saharan Africa, India, and Malaysia. Our project was in India, so that's where I'll focus. And in India, it's implemented by Smart Power India. And this is a group that brings together for-profit energy service companies, NGOs, and researchers. So about a year ago, Rockefeller asked us to explore how they could make this initiative more inclusive. And Rockefeller currently has a focus on inclusive economies, which they define as being equitable, participatory, growing, sustainable, and stable. So the goal of this effort was to look at how SPRD could intentionally address and improve equity in terms of individuals and households' access to and utility of energy. And that includes through developing micro-enterprises and value chains that would use the energy to spur equitable local economic development. So inclusion isn't just about increasing access, it's also using the energy to create inclusive local economic development. And because SPI works with for-profit energy companies, we focused on looking for market-based approaches. And as you'll see in the presentation, we found that sometimes market-based approaches might not be enough, and that we need to move beyond that and kind of more grant-based demand generation approaches. For our project with Rockefeller, we focused on inclusion of both women and other marginalized groups, meaning those from lower caste, scheduled tribes. But for this presentation, I'm going to focus more on gender, since that will align with what others are talking about as well. So in order to develop these strategies to enhance inclusion, we looked at existing monitoring data. We conducted key informant interviews with Smart Power India and other key stakeholders, and we conducted a preference survey among the sites where SPI is active, looking at customers' energy profiles, preferences, willingness to pay, demand, etc. So what we found, on the national level, we know that about 1/4 of India's rural population lacks access to energy. In the states where SPRD is active, it's much higher. When we look at the specific SPRD sites, these two graphs tell us, the one on the left is telling us that the SPRD catchment, or geographic area, is socially excluded groups are more likely to be left out of that geographic area, which can make sense because they're more kind of on the periphery of where the grid is laid. However, even within the catchment, the geographic area, socially excluded groups are more likely to not be connected to the grid. So what's driving this exclusion? First of all, geography, as I just showed on the previous slide. From the preference survey in these two graphs down here, cost was one of the main drivers. People said that it's just too expensive. Also, there's a latent demand. So among both users and non-users, they reported that they have low levels of demand for energy, which told us that they're really just not aware of the benefits they could experience if they had access to energy. So using that information we gathered, we developed the following menu of inclusion strategies that I'm going to go over today and are also included in the brief that you might have been able to pick up out there. These are strategies to increase access, to improve the way that people are using energy to create more inclusive local economic development. And while these strategies were built and designed for SPRD's context in India, and so in some cases build off of the efforts they're already doing, they're also applicable to other contexts throughout the globe. The kind of 4 main categories of strategies are enhance capacity of energy company supply chains, test innovations in energy package and supply, provide more accessible and affordable financing and payment methods, and generate demand through local economic development. And for each strategy, we have these little boxes that show the varying levels of potential business and social impacts, and also the level of resources and partnerships required. And you'll see as we go through that some of the strategies have kind of immediate, great business returns, low resource, high business impact. Other of the strategies require more investment up front, maybe a longer time horizon to build demand and eventually get those business impacts. So the first category is related to supply chain. And the strategy on the left is really about training supply chain actors. So first, just looking at customer service agents. These are the sales agents. Training them to understand who they're reaching, who they're not reaching, and helping them think through how they can adjust their marketing methods and messages to better reach those who are not being reached. On the left is on the right is employing women throughout the value chain. So again, primarily in that sales agent role. Often women aren't employed in that role in energy companies because of gender norms, mobility constraints. But studies have shown that when women are the sales agents of these energy products, they're able to reach more diverse customers and develop kind of more trusting relationships with customers. And similarly, involving women as customer service agents and kind of repair and maintenance can help improve customer satisfaction and kind of keep that good rapport with customers. And an example of that is Barefoot College in India trains cadres of female solar engineers, so often older solar grandmas, to repair solar products and systems. The next set of strategies relates to package and supply. So the first one is related to provision of energy for lighting public goods. So with the mini grid, there's still going to be households who can't afford to connect, and they're not going to be able to experience the benefits of energy access. But providing electricity for public goods, such as lighting, schools, health clinics, banks, post offices, enables kind of the most marginalized in a community to still experience the benefits of energy access, and also can motivate them to experience those benefits and want to connect their own household in the future and kind of generate that demand. The middle option is a total energy solution. So the idea here is to provide 24-hour coverage to a set kind of geographic location. Every household in that location gets reliable 24-hour energy at a price point that's subsidized so that everyone can afford it. And the idea here is that as a community, a whole community has access to energy, it will increase economic development, which will kind of enable the community as a whole to have more desire for energy, more ability to pay for energy. And the hypothesis is that over time, their demand, their willingness to pay will increase and eventually converge on a sustainable price. And the final strategy here is related to distributing energy-using and time-saving appliances. So we know that women spend a disproportionate amount of time collecting firewood, cooking, collecting water. And so appliances like energy-efficient Cookstoves and irrigation pumps can kind of attract new customers who want those products, can increase their usage of energy because productive use uses more energy than just lighting, and also increase their demand over time. This set of strategies relates to financing and payment methods. So on the left, we want to talk about smart meters. We know that low-income customers often have inconsistent and unreliable incomes, making it hard for them to commit to a flat monthly rate for paying for electricity. And so using smart meters allows the customer to align their energy consumption with their ability to pay that month. However, smart meters are very expensive. And so we've seen that where they're rolled out, it's usually the most well-off households that opt in. So some options to help make smart meters more affordable are doing mobile payments. This helps reduce transaction costs, differential pricing, so charging more for energy usage at night than during the daytime. This can help the company bring in more revenue, and also financing the meter over time. And then the strategy on the right here is providing financing for upfront connections and also the appliances. This type of financing can be provided through self-help groups, microfinance, revolving loans, NGOs, payment installments. An interesting example that SPI is already doing is around irrigation pumps. So they worked with a self-help group to pool their money, purchase an irrigation pump and the pipes that go along with it, and then members rent out the irrigation pump to irrigate their fields when they need to, and that money is used to pay for the energy that's needed to run the irrigation pumps. And this final set of strategies is related to generating demand. The first one is related to micro-enterprise development. So this is working to create enterprises that will use energy, which not only provides income-generating opportunities for women, but also, consumes much more energy and so is more profitable for the energy companies. So some examples here would be creating new enterprises that use energy, such as tailoring, sewing using electronic sewing machines, converting existing enterprises to energy use, such as a beauty or salon, kind of introducing energy-using appliances, or expanding existing enterprises through provision of more reliable energy. So an example of this is cold storage. So individuals that have cold storage enterprises are often nervous because if the energy goes out, everything that they were storing is spoiled. But if they know they're going to have this reliable access, they could expand their business and kind of feel more confident that things will go well. And the final strategy here is related to creating energy-enabled value chains. So this is identifying or creating an industry that will be run on energy and also create forward and backward linkages in the community. And an example of something that SBI is doing here is related to garment factories. So the garment factories source the cotton from the local community, they employ women in using electronic sewing machines, and then they create employment through their kind of linkages to market and distribution. And both of those examples consume much more energy, and so it's very profitable for the energy company. So some takeaways from all of these strategies are that market-based approaches may not be enough to adequately stimulate demand, especially in areas where there's a low willingness to pay. And there might be kind of more longer-term demand generation initiatives that are necessary. An interesting tidbit here was actually the Global Clean Cooking Forum that the Global Alliance for Clean Cooking hosts. And a man was talking, he came from the public health sector, and he was kind of reflecting on this clean energy sector and saying, in public health, when you want to change a behavior through product use, you first generate demand. You distribute free condoms. You have, social behavior change communication programs. You do this over years, and condoms are low price and increase, and eventually you've created a market where people are actually willing to pay full price for that product. But interestingly, the clean energy sector has tried to kind of go at it from this other angle where they're trying to be profitable and market-based from the start. But there might be this need for longer-term demand generation before we can just be using all market-based approaches. Also, another takeaway is it can be very challenging to convince energy service companies to integrate gender into their operations. These companies have small profit margins, they're really focused on their bottom line, and they need to see the evidence of how integrating gender is actually going to influence their bottom line. And so we need, we need to build that evidence, case studies, quantitative data to be able to convince them of these impacts. And this relates to the final point of need to explore the impacts of longer demand generation efforts. Some of the examples I provided will take a long time to generate the necessary demand, and we kind of need to know, do these efforts actually stimulate local economic development? Does that increase demand? Will people actually have increasing willingness to pay? And so these are kind of studies we need to do, and I'm glad because many of my panelists are already testing and studying some of these different gender integration methods, and so we'll hear more from them, hopefully, about what they're finding around what works.
Thank you, Ali. I think we're going to save the questions to the end, and so we can move to our next panelist.
Great.
That's me.
Okay, great.
Well, thank you again to Allie for inviting Value for Women to come and speak today. Again, my name is Stephanie Finnegan. I'm a program manager at Value for Women. I won't give the sales pitch on about what Value for Women is, just due to time, but if anybody has questions, you can let me know. Long story short, we are a social enterprise that focuses on working with both nonprofits and the private sector to on various different gender inclusion initiatives, and we have a special emphasis on women's entrepreneurship and SMEs. So I've been spending most of this year focused on a project we have right now with the Shell Foundation, which has been funded by DFID, and it's on gender inclusion strategies for energy SMEs. It's a pilot program that has been going on for just under a year. We aren't finished yet, so I'll caveat this whole talk by saying the data is very, very new, and I don't have a ton of specific data points to share. I do have a lot of lessons learned so far, and in the next coming weeks and months as things roll out, there'll be a lot more information that'll be available on exactly what the data looks like. But that being said, I think, especially after hearing what Allie just spoke about, I think this is a really great complement to what ICRW has been working on with Rockefeller. So let's see. There we go. So, so just to set the stage, the key objectives of what we've been working on, and the research question that we were looking at is really which are the gender inclusions strategies that are going to have the biggest business impact for SMEs. So that's kind of where we started this whole thing. Was we figured whatever we're going to do in this pilot, we're going to try and figure out what actually has an impact on the business's bottom line, and that shaped the rest of our work. And we had two major objectives with the pilot. We wanted to, number one, do exactly what we're doing right now, which is to try and contribute more data and research and learnings to this space around building the business case for gender inclusion for SMEs. So I think we all know in this room, there's a growing amount of data around why gender inclusion is good for Fortune 500 companies, for big businesses. When you get to talking about SMEs, there's a lot less data. So we wanted to really try and contribute some research and learnings to that conversation. And we also wanted to look at really practical ways, practical tools that, that SMEs can use, ideally that they'd be able to adopt on their own without the support of a Value for Women or another technical partner, that they can implement into their own organizations that will really help improve the bottom line for their business while also increasing their gender inclusion work. So to that end, the pilot has been testing a series of tools. And at the end of January, early February, we will be publishing a toolkit that will be kind of have like the best in show of the strategies that we tested during the pilot. That toolkit will be available to a wider set of SMEs so that we can continue to collect much more robust data in the coming, hopefully, 1 to 2 years. So just setting the stage, the pilot itself, we initially started with Shell Foundation's a large piece of their portfolio. For those that don't know, they work with clean energy SMEs, mostly in India and East Africa. They support about 50 of them. So we looked at their whole portfolio and then went through a whole process and scaled down to end up working with 5 partners for this pilot. The 5 partners are now testing 13 strategies in total. And the partners are looking at strategies across marketing, sales, recruitment, and market research. You'll notice HR is not here, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, but the kind of initial assumption is that gender inclusion would include HR when you're doing this kind of test. And for a lot of reasons, mostly due to timing, because we had a short window of time to do this pilot, and we know that in order to really prove a business impact, if you're doing that with HR, you need a much longer window. So we didn't include HR in this phase. We're hoping to do so in the coming phase. The partners are in India, Kenya, and Mexico. They range in size. The smallest one is 10 employees, roughly. They're a little bit bigger now, and the largest is just over 900. So it's a pretty big range in terms of the size of the organizations that we're working with. There's 4 B2Cs and there's 1 B2B. I'll talk about that in a moment too, because finding good strategies for B2Bs was a lot harder than we thought it would be. So that's another challenge we'll be working on. And then the timeline. So again, back in January, we started the research and assessment of the partners. Then we rolled into the tool definition and partner selection phase. That took us a lot longer than we anticipated, that second one there. So, and the reason was because I'll talk about in a moment what our strategy was, but it really took a long time to figure out who the right partners were for this particular pilot and what the right strategies were for them to test, and then selling this all through. So we ended up with 5 fantastic partners that I will rave about forever. But even with them, it takes a long time, right, to get buy-in and sign off and all these things, commitment of resources. So that window was much bigger than we thought it would be. We went on to pilot testing starting in September, and we've been testing now through the end of December, which is why we're not done yet. So, and then the results, as I said, will be out at the end of January, early February in the form of a toolkit. So the big lessons learned, because again, I don't have a lot of data to share, but I've got a ton of lessons. So I think the big lessons, I tried to pull out 4, which I think would be kind of most relevant for people here, particularly if you're thinking about gender inclusion when you're working at the SME level. And the first one is that there's this very common thinking, as I mentioned, that gender inclusion equals HR. So I would go, I went and met with a number of the potential pilot partners, and I walked in the room, and I would say hello and say who I was, and I would get immediately directed to the HR director. And while I wanted to talk to the HR director, I also wanted to talk to the salespeople and the marketing people. And so it took a lot to really sort of help SMEs understand that by gender inclusion, there's a lot that can be done. We aren't only talking about family leave policy or how many women are on board, right? So we have really focused our strategies on sales and marketing and things that we know can, in a shorter term, drive the businesses, drive an impact for the businesses. We also decided that gender inclusion needs a Trojan horse approach, this was kind of my favorite lesson. Not to be sneaky about it, but just the reality is the SMEs that we've been working with, and I think it's true for pretty much any business, is they're trying to keep the doors open, keep the lights on, go to a new market, find new customers. Like, they're busy, they're under-resourced, and so to get them to really get excited about committing to gender inclusion strategies, it's not always the easiest thing. So what we ended up doing was really flipping our process around, and instead of me walking in and saying, here's all these gender inclusion strategies you can pick from and what works for you, we really went in and said, look, what's your business problem? And we really tried to have conversations about what the business challenge is, and then we applied a gender lens to that. And we're like, all right, does this challenge have a gendered solution to it? Is this challenge triggered by gender in any way? And it was really, really interesting to see how many of the business challenges there was a gender element to it. And so that was a great way to get our foot in the door and get the businesses engaged, and also get them to see gender inclusion in a totally different way that breaks out of that HR bucket. The third is that data is underutilized, but has a huge, it can unlock huge business potential. So I think data is kind of the low-hanging fruit. And by that, what we mean is that most SMEs are collecting a ton of data already, and a lot of them have gender disaggregated data. They're sitting on a gold mine and they're not really even aware of it, or if they are, they don't know how to use it. Or it could take a very tiny tweak to get gender disaggregated data. So we were like, all right, that sort of seems to be the easiest way to get a business involved and get them to start to think about sales and marketing and other areas of their business in the gender disaggregated or gender inclusive way. It's by looking at gender disaggregated data. So that's kind of a low-hanging fruit. And then finally, the last learning was we only need a small carrot to see impact. And so this was, and it's a bit to the question about where do, what approaches need grant funding, what approaches really don't, and this thinking is just, most organizations, and us included when we got started, thought it was going to take a lot more funding than it actually did to actually get these initiatives launched and get these tools and strategies launched. And what we found out was it actually doesn't have to take a ton of funding or a ton of resources from the organization in order to get some of these strategies off the ground. If we're talking about making a shift in your sales team, that's a few days of training and then somebody to monitor it. So it doesn't have to be this massive investment. And that was a really happy surprise for both us and the organizations when we realized that, because we felt like, wow, this really shows us this could be scalable. So I'll talk about 2 quick successes. There's been an article circulating around some of our networks that Shell Foundation put out, sort of going into these in more detail, so I'm happy to send that around if someone doesn't have it and wants to read it. But basically, we have 2 of the organizations that have a direct sales force, and they're selling products to women, and most of their sales force is made up of women. They were having very different challenges, and so we tried different strategies, and we've had some interesting learnings. One organization, their challenge was, and I think Ali spoke to this a bit, the fact that their sales reps are pretty limited, particularly they're women, in their mobility. So because of security reasons, because of cultural reasons, the the women really can only sell in a certain area. And so we wanted to kind of find ways that they could expand where they're selling. So we were testing a few different strategies to try and help them break out and sell into other areas. And in the first 2 weeks that this organization tested the 2 strategies we recommended, they saw that there were sales that were greater in the first 2 weeks than they had had in the previous 3 months for that pilot group, which was really exciting. And that data, again, we're continuing to get more, so I can't get specific on the numbers yet, but it was a huge indicator to us that we're looking at something that has some big potential. And then the other organization had an interesting challenge in that they were having lots of performance problems and retention problems with the women in their sales team. And so we went through a whole process of revising their entire recruitment strategy and hiring process. But their concern internally, a bit unspoken too, was that, but we were able to kind of suss it out, was that they didn't want to make it harder to get the job because they were concerned that there wouldn't be enough women in the applicant pool who would meet those qualifications. And they wanted to hire women mostly because they found that women perform better in sales for them. So, but when we did increase the standards that had to be met, they found that 100% of the sales reps they actually hired in the pilot were women, and that the majority of their applicants were still women. So we kind of, even though I don't have data yet on their performance, we were able to kind of dispel this internal myth of the organization that there aren't enough women that could meet this higher qualification that would be in their applicant pool. So that was another success. It hasn't all been rosy, so it's definitely, I have circles under my eyes, but this isn't an easy pilot to do. And so a couple of the challenges I wanted to point out was just the time commitment of this business first approach, which I mentioned. So in a lot of ways, it takes a lot more time to go into an SME and try and talk to them about their business challenges, get them to open up to you about it, build that trust, and then think of solutions for them that aren't just like kind of the common solution. It's, let's think of is there a gender opportunity here in this solution? So that process takes a lot more time up front and a lot more of the resources of my team, et cetera, than we had anticipated. So that was one challenge. Another challenge was, this one kind of broke my heart, but it was realizing that at least for this pilot, not every SME was going to be the right fit. So this is one that we're going to continue to kind of test in phase 2, but I want to believe that every single business is ready for these opportunities and these strategies right now. And it might not be the case. We found that we were kind of trying to shoehorn in some strategies to organizations where it just wasn't a fit, and it ended up kind of not being a good use of their time or ours, unfortunately, because they just weren't ready for the strategies that we had. They might not be far enough along in their state and their growth. Also, B2Bs were, again, as I mentioned, they were more difficult to find strategies for. So not to say that those organizations can't participate at all, but we're going to have to spend a lot more time thinking about how to address those business needs. And then finally, just having an internal champion is really important. As I said, we have 5 fantastic organizations, and we had internal champions at each of them. But you do need somebody who's willing to keep an eye on this and check in on it and look at the data and have phone calls and not let the rest of the business kind of creep in. So finding that internal champion takes a little bit of time, and then like holding on to that person for dear life is a really so that's it. Happy to answer questions during the panel time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think Rachel will be next.
Great. So I know the time is short, so I'm just going to give a really quick overview of what the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves is, for those of you who are not familiar. But I did just want to start and thank ICRW for inviting us to this event. We've been in partnership with Allie and other colleagues at ICRW for about 3 years now. And it's been such a great working relationship, and really excited that you all have energy access as one of your main focus areas now, and continue working towards that goal. Okay, so just a quick overview. So the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves is a global partnership that brings together partners from the private sector, NGOs, government, you name it, anyone who is concerned about or thinking about clean cooking, cookstoves and fuels. We bring them together at the global level, and then work by focusing on about 8 focus countries right now around the world in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And so the idea is to look at this global issue of 3 billion people who are affected by traditional and open fire cooking practices. So we're looking at about 500 million households, 2.6 million deaths annually that are attributable to household air pollution. And obviously this has a huge impact on women's livelihoods, the health of families, and kind of even at the community level, there's a high level of air pollution caused by clean cooking in addition to the other causes of air pollution. And the goal of our organization has been to reach 100 million households by 2020. We're more than halfway there, and we're also kind of, as we move forward between now and 2020, looking at how that strategy, is that still going to remain our goal, or are we going to look at longer term SDG impacts through 2030 and how we want to really get to that point where we're having a direct impact on these households. And of course, there's other issues like protecting the environment and just generally looking at not only forest degradation, but how we can reduce the emissions that are contributing to global climate change. So the Alliance has a specific gender strategy and has from the very beginning. We're looking at not only it as an issue that affects women who are the primary cooks and managers of household energy, but also how they can be engaged in the sector and benefit from the economic opportunities and the income generation that may come along with expanding this market. So women obviously are going to be the ones that have the greatest influence in the household as to which technologies are adopted. So looking at more user-informed design and research that can allow women to contribute to the, what those products should actually look like, if they should be designed in a way that they will actually use them and adopt them in the long term for their households. And then also looking at women as entrepreneurs. Typically, as we've been kind of discussing here in this conversation, women are one of the fastest growing cohorts of entrepreneurs around the world, but they don't necessarily get the same access to resources or tools that they need to be successful entrepreneurs. And so we've been looking at, what kind of strategies can we use to work with our enterprise partners, work at the policy level to create an enabling environment for women's entrepreneurship in the different countries and contexts that we work in. These are the four kind of key high-level challenges that we identified early on to really scaling women's empowerment and engagement in the clean cooking sector as entrepreneurs and employees. So looking at the capacity of implementing organizations, which are typically smaller social enterprises who are on the ground in the communities designing and developing solutions. So we identified that there is a lack of knowledge or information around what some of the potential impacts are for not only women as users, but women as employees and entrepreneurs. We recognized that there was a gap in financing for enterprises either that are owned or led by women, but also enterprises who are interested in taking some of these more gender-informed approaches, but like others have been mentioning, don't have really the time or resources that they need to focus on that as one of their major outcomes. There's also historically been a gap in the evidence around gender. We've been working to support the sector to commission research studies to really show that there are benefits to engaging women as sales agents, the woman-to-woman marketing practices that are more effective, and kind of helping build that evidence base so that we can make the case to bring small and medium enterprises on board. And then finally, we are housed within the United Nations Foundations, which is a large organization that does a lot of global advocacy with the United Nations. And so a lot of our work is also around influencing policies and raising awareness around the issue so that it can be incorporated into some of these high-level global development areas. So one area of our work is the Women's Empowerment Fund. That sort of falls under our financing pillar, where we recognize that there is a gap in support for enterprises who are really interested and motivated by the gender issues that they run into in implementation, but didn't really have the funding that they needed to adequately address them. And so the Women's Empowerment Fund has been around for about 4 years now. We have worked with over 15 grantees around pretty much everywhere around the world, not only in our focus countries, but also in a few countries in Asia, Latin America that we have not traditionally been working in. The picture here is from one of our partners in Uganda, AEST, which is a partner that our colleagues at ICRW have also worked with very closely. So that's an example of one of the enterprises that we work with, which is woman-owned, woman-led, really looking at some of the challenges in the value chain and how to better reach communities through the production of, in this case, these carbonized charcoal briquettes that are a more efficient burning fuel for some of the cookstove options. So I just wanted to highlight a case study from a more recent grantee. Part of our learning and knowledge sharing process is going to be releasing case studies from the past 4 years of the Women's Empowerment Fund. This is just kind of a little example of one of the case studies that we're going to be putting out to the public to add to the growing amount of knowledge that's out there. So Burn Manufacturing is a private enterprise that's based in Kenya. They largely work with urban populations, but are also working on a wood-burning stove that is reaching some of the more rural populations in Kenya. So Burn, under their grant for the Women's Empowerment Fund, they were testing out financing mechanisms through women's groups to see, which financing options are the most effective or helpful for women who typically cannot afford the upfront cost of some of these more expensive household energy products. And so first, their approach was to work through chamas, which are informal women's savings group based in Kenya. So they tested out 3 different mechanisms. One was an in-house financing where Burn would require that they pay 50% for the product up front and then 2 additional monthly payments that were interest-free. That was one option. The next option was actually financing through the chama or the women's group itself. So they collect the funds together, and then the chama at the administrative level then makes the purchase from the private enterprise. And the third option was looking at a mobile payment system, which didn't ultimately end up working out because the platform that they wanted to use had not been fully realized by the time the project was happening. But they did find that in this case, where they were working with low-income women, that they did really trust kind of these informal financing mechanisms and didn't necessarily need to go to a financial institution to be able to make those purchases. So the most successful option was really doing the 50% deposit through Burn financing and then making those 2 additional payments. But then a lot of the women also preferred going through the chamas because they had that safety network. They trusted their peers. They knew that they could follow through on that option. And that kind of leads to the other point about shorter payback periods. They had initially imagined that maybe 5 payments would be useful, helpful for those in the chamas, but what they found is that women actually wanted to pay them off quicker because they were concerned about being in debt for a much longer period of time. Another component to the program is that they were recruiting product ambassadors, so not necessarily sales agents, but women within those groups who were particularly passionate about the product and really wanted to go out into their community and promote it and encourage others to purchase it. They did run into some challenges with this approach. I think they found that many people initially were very enthusiastic about it, but ultimately there only ended up being like a handful of individuals who followed through on some of those commitments to going out and promoting the products into the community. And so this is actually a theme that we have learned through other grants under the Women's Empowerment Fund. So when you're engaging with women as sales agents and entrepreneurs, there's going to be a huge drop-off in terms of the number of people that you recruit who actually will sustain that type of activity in the long run. And there's a lot of factors for that. It's the unpaid work burden that people have at home that they can't necessarily just add on another activity or job because they realize they have 10 other responsibilities that they need to prioritize. But what we found is that in this case and also with other grantees, women who have prior sales experience and really kind of already know what some of those promotional behaviors and activities are and how they can be effective, they tend to be the ones that are more likely to be retained as sales agents or promoters for these products. So clean energy products are more expensive, they're logistically more challenging to get around, and so for someone who's a new entrepreneur and doesn't have that experience or motivation, it's a really intimidating effort to take on. And so it's likely that after a couple of months, if you can't make a few sales, you might move on to something else. So that's been one big lesson learned across the board. And then finally, the woman-to-woman marketing, which was already brought up earlier from other experiences. We commissioned a research study in Kenya about 2 or 3 years ago at this point, where we found that not only could women outsell men when they received the same type of training and capacity building, which had some added elements of leadership and self-esteem, but also that woman-to-woman marketing is more effective. And Byrne, in their WEF grant, actually had the same experience. So they found that almost 100% of their new champions were women, and this project really motivated them to take a more proactive recruitment stance on hiring women as sales agents, and then also incorporating more women as managers and other types of employees in their company. So building from kind of 4 or so years of the Women's Empowerment Fund, the Alliance had the opportunity to host a workshop in Kenya this year, which Genevieve from ICRW was there and helped me do basically the whole thing. So I'm very thankful to her for that. So the Women's Energy Entrepreneurship Workshop convened about 100 different individuals from over 65 organizations in over 14 countries. So as you can see, a very diverse group of people here. And these are all partners who are looking at women's energy entrepreneurship. What are some of the lessons learned and best practices that they've been implementing over the years, and kind of reflecting back on that work and how we can work together as a community to continue to highlight what some of those best practices are and where some of the gaps remain. So here's just like a quick snapshot in terms of surveying those who attended the workshop. These are the key barriers that people felt women are still really facing in the clean energy sector. So obviously the major area of issue is access to finance, which I think we come across across the board in other sectors, but especially in energy. But then also a few interesting topics that came up. Mentorship was really discussed as a hot topic throughout the workshop. We found that, we've done a lot of training, we've come up with really great training programs, but there's not necessarily that availability of follow-on support, coaching, peer mentorship. And so we got really excited about that topic, and I think moving forward, that's something that the Alliance and some of our other partners will be prioritizing. And then some of the other issue areas, kind of the continued capacity development, technical skills, and then the issues that women more uniquely face, looking at cultural constraints, self-esteem, confidence, and their ability to really feel confident to be entrepreneurs. So some of the key lessons learned and promising practices that within the group discussions came out, which were very much in line with what the Alliance has been looking at, but they also helped us kind of think through it more intentionally. So the issue of engaging and sensitizing men about women's role in the value chain. A lot of our partners through the WEF and through other mechanisms have tested this out, having dialogues between men and women and kind of testing out what those methods are. So not only engaging male community leaders and household members, but thinking about when is it appropriate to do mixed gender groups, or if you need to have separate conversations with men and women to sensitize them to the role of women in the workplace. Agency-based empowerment and leadership training. This is a program that has been going on for about 3 or more years at this point, looking at specific agency and leadership skills that you can provide to women in the energy sector. And so I think the group as a whole agreed that that was really key in terms of really enhancing self-esteem, self-confidence, and resiliency for entrepreneurs, and that's something that should continue on, considering, again, some of the unique challenges in the energy sector. In terms of working with women, recruiting and retaining them, offering flexible work options, making sure that they have the option to come at maybe different times of day than the typical 9 to 5 or what the standard expectation has been, and then creating performance-related payments. So if it's on the production side of a cook stove or a fuel you actually pay them based on the number of products or materials that they have been able to do in the amount of time that they are committing to work that day. And so that just makes it a little bit so they can come and maybe only spend like 2 hours at a time here, 2 hours at a time there, and then continue to fulfill the other responsibilities that they have. Like I said, mentorship came up. That was just a big issue in a big area that I think the sector as a whole wants to move forward with strengthening. Continuing to look at strengthening women's networks. That really helps address the access to financing issue, but it can also give them more collective bargaining power, maybe to negotiate, a rate from a manufacturer if they're going to be making a bulk purchase. And then finally, continuing to engage with local governments and really intentionally making partnerships at the community level so that there's not only buy-in from the women who want to purchase or sell the products, but that the community at large is aware of what some of the negative implications are of traditional cooking, and then can really kind of bring the community forward together. So I think that pretty much sums up what I'm going to present on. I did want to share this list of tools and resources that the Alliance has available on its website. The resource guide for scaling adoption of clean cooking solutions through women's empowerment was put out back in 2013. And so that's actually a pretty nice summary of the different best practices and lessons learned prior to 2013 for the clean cooking sector. And the workshop that we hosted was kind of a follow-on to that resource guide. And then I've listed a few others here that hopefully when the slides are shared, you can have access to. So thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And last but not least, Tom from USADF. And how are we supporting?
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what USADF is. I want to talk about our Power Africa and our relationship with Power Africa. I want to talk about our Offgrid Energy Challenge, and then finally our Women in Energy Challenge. And first I want to thank everyone for inviting us, and this is really exciting to me. And I have some ideas, maybe in a question and answer session we can talk about this. I'd love to take this on the road, actually. Do something more here. So USADF is a there we go. USADF is a U.S. government agency. We're an independent agency with a government corporation, actually. We support African, we work only in sub-Saharan Africa, support African-owned and African-managed enterprises. Power Africa, as so you know, and I want to, Denise, there she is, sorry, thank you. Denise, our relationship with Denise Mortimer actually started as Denise was our essentially point of contact and also what we call liaison person for between USADF and Power Africa. And so Denise came to us as in that role, but actually really helped us with her leadership on the gender side, and in a sense of simply asking us questions, what are we doing and what more could we do? And we'll get into that, some of the things we've been able to do, but Denise is a real leader and has been a real leader for us. And it's been a wonderful thing for USADF. Power Africa, of course, is an interagency, a U.S. government initiative started by President Obama that's continuing on, essentially led by USAID, but includes 12 different agencies. USADF is one of those agencies, and we work in the we work on the far end, the off-grid energy sector only, renewables, and with small grassroots groups in Africa. Then gender at USADF, I'm going to go through quickly for time constraints, but we can talk questions afterwards. It's always been a focus at USADF, and we always continue to see what more and more we can do. And USADF recognizes the need to empower women to participate in the development of their countries, and USADF endeavors to invest heavily in them, which often means that we sometimes set targets. For example, half of our grants to community groups should be to women-owned, women-managed, or majority women or women-focused organizations. Two of the key aspects: funding investments and increase women's access to and control over development capital, which includes things like that land credit processing, and also distilling and capturing the evidence of their empowerment. In other words, how do we measure that? How do we show what we're doing? And how do we then actually build on those successes of what we're doing? It includes grants that, like I said, women-led, women empowerment of women is the main objective, and direct or indirect beneficial impact at the community level. We have some special initiatives, one called the Willie Grace Campbell Initiative, but others where we're working doing this specifically. And well, we can get into questions about women-led or what actually that means, but in the Offgrid Energy Challenge, which we'll get to, we focus on should be women-owned majority, should be women managed. In other words, the CEO and the main management should be female. And we need to, the board of directors and the governance of it needs clearly to be what would I say, women majority and women focused. So we get very, what would I say, we get very clear on what this is and what we do, and we want to make sure that we're not putting forward things that are not what women-led is. So. Then let me talk quickly. Offgrid Energy at USADF. We were one of the founding folks with Power Africa. What we started to do and what we continue to doing is we're doing off-grid energy grants through off-grid energy challenges. We've been focused on 9 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We're continuing to do this. We've done over 75 investments in 9 countries that. Primarily, the technology is solar, wind, hydro, biomass, and biogas, but solar 75%, and solar primarily broken down to that would be either solar mini grids, a small mini grid in a village, or solar home systems. And then we have we can say very clearly 120 individuals connected so far. We focused one of our measurements is connections, and our investments are in 13 women-owned African energy enterprises. Of those 75, this was prior or in conjunction or before we actually started the Women in Energy initiative. So the Women in Energy Challenge. This is a picture from Uganda. That's Ambassador Deborah Malik on the left. Our two winners in Uganda, and Andy Gershkovitz, who's head of Power Africa, on the right. This is one of our events. Earlier this year, I think it was in August and August, September. But the Women in Energy Challenge, what that is we realized we were funding some women organizations, some women-led organizations. We realized there was a huge opportunity here. One of the opportunities we've addressed is we're funding African-owned and African-managed organizations, which is a niche that we found, folks are doing that, maybe inadvertently or they're not, but it's not their focus. And we found that we focused that, and that's a huge, very, very important sector that is either overlooked or not actually or secondary. Let's say. So then, an extension of that, then we say, well, then we're funding women in energy organizations. It's the same thing. It's a very, very important sector. It's essentially not focused on as a primary focus from other organizations, and we launched this just about a year ago in September of 2016. These organizations need to be African-owned and African-managed only. They need to be women-owned, in that sense, a minimum of 51% owned by women, and then women-managed, like I said, primarily the management, the top management, and the primary management has to be women. We developed this. We saw that there was, just a small number of women-owned enterprises in the organizations that were that have applied. Why? Because there's a small number that exist, and so I mean, one of our objectives is to increase that number and also then support the ones that are out there and help them to replicate and expand what they're doing. So we decided to specifically target women-owned and women-managed enterprises. Previous to that, what we've been doing is we've been adding scoring points to our when we're evaluating the criteria and evaluating enterprises. If they're women-owned, women-managed, they get more points. Well, in effect, that was good, and that helped, and we probably funded a couple more than we would have. But it helped us to realize what more can we do, what practical step we can do. Well, we can actually focus on this rather than just, I mean, it's good to do that and supports that, but if we focus on it, then we can actually have much more direct and immediate impact. These grants are all to commercially viable enterprises, so market-based, market-driven, and we look for how they can be long-term profitable and how they can expand in a profitable way. And so part of what we're doing an initial round of funding, but then we look for expansion grants to help them expand what they're doing. Some of the lessons learned from this business approach, we're approaching what we might say younger enterprises. In other words, we're not doing any strictly startups, but we're focusing on organizations that may need help with their financial systems. We may need to fund things like hiring accountants. We may need to do a little bit more than we might do with other organizations. We need flexibility on the grant size. Some of the early stage ones, we ended doing a smaller grant at $50,000 as opposed to $100,000 because it was more appropriate with the idea that we can fund them again and then possibly again. Sometimes we needed flexibility on the timelines. In other words, if we had a 12-month grant, we decided this one, if you're building up capacity within the organization, maybe it needs 18 months, maybe it needs 24 months. So we made sure we had that flexibility. We've worked, and it's one of the exciting things about today, but I think we have a network here of follow-on funders, how we can fund these organizations beyond ADF, and where we could connect them to what organizations we could help support them. We found that also that our grant funding, and we primarily do grants, although we've got a couple of other vehicles, is generally grant funding is necessary. Why? We still think of a market-based approach, but it's really addressing a market failure. And if you can address that market failure, and then we're moving them up into commercial viability, supporting them to move themselves up that way, and profitable expansion. Some of the successes the grant's designed $50,000 to $100,000. The length is somewhat flexible. We don't want to go too much over 24 months. Intensive local assistance, what we do is we have a local support partner in every country, and they give business advisory services, and they go to the stage of mentoring them to a certain extent along the way, but they certainly work very closely with them on a daily and week-to-week basis. We can operate in multiple languages, whether it be French, English, Swahili, others, local languages as well. So how has our work built a business case for gender? We have a lot of things here, but we've heard a little bit of this earlier. Women are often best positioned to harness the first mile distribution systems. We heard about women sales agents. That's women-to-women marketing, great. That's really important. But simply women sales agents who are there, it's worked very well for us. We built that into, or we've had folks propose that to us. We supported that, and we found that successful. Women's savings and loan associations. In other words, you might have a cooperative or a SACOS that's loaning to women to buy to buy energy products. So that's one way where we can have direct impact, where we can support that. And then women's cooperatives that are primarily focused on women, supporting them directly. And we found women are often best positioned to harness energy for productive use. We can talk about a couple of examples here. It goes beyond just solar home systems, but what we mean by productive use would be, let me slip over one, we'll go back, but solar refrigeration for vegetables, for fish, solar water pumping for irrigation, solar milling, solar powered drying. And then actual examples, SOSAI, which is in northern Nigeria, they've installed 2 mini grids in Kaduna State. We heard about smart metering, but they're involved with smart metering. We also have they're using solar drying for those peppers that they have there and tomatoes, dramatically increasing their value and then their yields. And these local entrepreneurs, we heard this also, but they're using electricity to diversify their businesses. So you put power out there, and immediately the businesses start developing. And often those are women, small micro businesses run by women. NBK Electrical Consulting. This is one of our from Ethiopia, one of our women's organizations. Founded by this microelectronics engineer, they developed by putting together different disparate components, their first solar home system designed in Ethiopia for Ethiopians. We supported them to grant starting with initial batch. They're scaling up right now and working this, and they're signing agreements with microfinance institutions and others to be able to sell this, so to make it affordable essentially at the grassroots level so that women can pay over time. And then actually, what we find, of course, is once they pay something like this over time, then they're ready to move up to the next step. Once they're starting to use electricity, the demand grows, and they find ways to pay for that. So these are just a couple of other examples. Refrigeration, solar, this is the top middle one there is a solar water kiosk that we've supported in Kenya. On the right is solar-powered maize milling, and that's also in Kaduna State in northern Nigeria. And so these fish aren't being refrigerated, but solar-powered refrigeration for fish on the coast in Kenya. So that was quick, but I wanted to mention Claudia Schwartz, who's our leader with Offgrid Energy at USADF. And Claudia and I, of course, work together. Claudia's in Ethiopia right now, working with some of the enterprises, so she couldn't be here today. And then myself, we're really the team for Offgrid Energy in USADF. So after that, I'll leave it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom. And we have about 15 minutes, according to our schedule, for questions. And here you go. Please, and introduce yourself if you.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Zim Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and looking at all these presentations, one of the themes seems to be women to women as far as business model, and that's very viable. I first ran into this when I was doing my doctoral research in Jamaica a number of years ago, and found out that if you have women empowered in business, things will advance. But going to Ali, Stephanie, Rachel, and even to Tom's point, is some of this you're saying that the impact of having women in these key roles, particularly in women to women or sales, is only I think you called it a medium impact. And I was just wondering why medium impact versus high impact, because some of the things that you think intuitively would be lower than that maybe is not the case. So this is to all four speakers, since you're all in that same women to women mode, I think.
Should we take a couple questions? Or?
Yes, I think we can just, yes, go ahead, Jeremy.
Hi, I'm Genevieve Smith with ICRW, and my question is for Value for Women. I was wondering if you could speak to a couple of you had some notes on your last slide related to that some SMEs are too early stage, and I guess I was wondering if they were too early stage for your specific strategies. If you could speak to that, because part of me, I would think that for some diversity and inclusion pieces, you actually would want to instill it at the earliest stage in order to, instill that into the culture. So if you could speak to that. And then also, you mentioned that B2B is more difficult to find strategies, and I'd be curious as to why. I have some assumptions maybe related to, women as the final consumers or something, but would just be curious for more information.
And if I can add to that, because those were both my questions as well, the size. You have a very large array, 500 to 900. Same thing. Small can be more innovative and malleable versus, don't have the resources and so forth. So if you can speak to that.
So Sarah Gamage, I direct the Economic Empowerment and Livelihoods program here at ICRW. My question is about the bundling of financing, and I think it seems pretty clear that you want to stimulate demand in many of these cases, and so having financing options for your clients is particularly important. But sort of how have you seen it work when that bundling is done either within the company that you're supporting, so maybe asking them to diversify into a whole area of service provision that they might not know very well, or when it's sort of done best with, complementary institutions that are already providing financing, partnering up with those enterprises that you've been supporting.
One more question and then we'll go to answers.
Thanks. Denise Mortimer, Power Africa. I also have a question for Stephanie. I was wondering if you could speak to the interventions that you've identified for the SMEs. How many of them are unique to the energy sector, and how many are just sort of could be applicable to any an SME in any sector? And if you could sort of give an example of a generic versus an energy specific. And then I think you said that some or one of your interventions led to sales increasing, they made more money in 2 weeks than they made in the previous 3 months. Can you speak to what some of those winning interventions are?
And I just have a follow-up from someone online for Stephanie as well.
I'm the one with the least data.
It's similar. It says, will your pilot study be showing impact on the SME revenues, profit, et cetera, after the general strategies have been implemented?
Okay, so I can take the first question about why we have the impact as medium. I think in this case is mini grid. So what Rockefeller is doing is all mini grid distribution for household energy. And so it really comes down to women's purchasing power and decision-making ability within the household. So it may be different when we're talking about solar lanterns or Cookstoves, that women might have more power over purchasing that item. But for electricity connections, it's, the female sales agent can convince the female household member and develop a good rapport, but whether or not she is the one who's actually making that final decision is not such a direct connection. So I think that's probably why we put that.
I'll just add to that. So the Alliance and ICRW have been working together again over the past 3 years to design and roll out a social impact measurement system for the clean cooking sector specifically. So we, ICRW did the desk research and the on-the-ground field work to test out and identify other types of impact metrics that have already been developed from the agriculture sector and other areas that we could then kind of craft and adapt for the clean cooking sector. And so we've been testing out those indicators and measurement methodologies with our Women's Empowerment Fund grantees. But it's still at a very small scale, and it's only been going on now for about a year or so. And so, we have found some changes in terms of the reported decision-making power that women who are engaged by some of these companies felt and reported, that they, did report a change and an increase in their ability to make decisions at the household level. But it's still, kind of new information that we're still collecting through these programs. So I would, kind of err on the side of caution with Allie as well. Like, we still need more data to really determine whether or not it's, high impact.
So maybe, Stephanie, if you can't think of those questions, you answer the financing question a little bit.
I'll talk fast. So the online question I can answer pretty quickly. We are going to release a fair amount of data in terms of the impact on the businesses, because that's the intent of this. It's going to be somewhat masked, or because we want to protect the integrity of the pilot partners that participated with us. So we're not going to give raw data, but we'll be able to show percentages if there was an increase that did impact sales and how that trickled out to, or how we expect that to expand out to the rest of the business. So yes, there will be more data coming on that. To Denise's questions, because I think I can answer a couple of them with one answer. So to the partner that we had, where I mentioned the success story, they tested 2 strategies, and again, this is kind of what I mean, the whole theme of all of this has been like, none of this is, these aren't like unicorn ideas, like they're pretty basic ideas. So, and that's kind of that's what makes them exciting, because I think it makes them scalable. So one idea was that the organization, they just traditionally did door-to-door sales, and so instead we had them kind of structure doing sales at weekly markets and sales at places where the women's sales agent would go and would just have a lot more access to more people. That required some additional training, because that's a different, you're doing a presentation in a crowd is quite different than a door-to-door sale where you're sitting in someone's living room. So there was some investment on their part there. But that was one of the strategies. And another strategy was related to the use of demo kits. So most of the women sales agents weren't able to afford the upfront cost of purchasing the demo kit. So we just said, look, let's just do this test, and we'll do a cost benefit analysis to see if you provide the demo kits to women sales agents, are they able to sell more using them, and can you cover those costs and then still see profit. So as I said, it was early days, but those were the two strategies we were looking at, and so far so good. And to that, those are two examples, I think, to your other question, which are that I think those are two examples of strategies that could be scaled outside the energy sector, right? Anybody selling a product to a household could be doing this. Anyone with a sales force, particularly a sales force with women who are facing specific gender challenges, this could be scaled out beyond the energy sector. And I think, I'm thinking off the top of my head of all 13 strategies, but I would say most of them could be adapted for the wider SME sector, which was kind of our goal in the beginning, was how scalable can we do this? And then to Genevieve's questions about the early stage. So my feeling right now is that it is exactly what you just said, is that I think a lot of, especially when we come to things about like recruitment and management and policy, HR policies and things like that, I think that should be baked in from the beginning of a business. So even the most small businesses or new businesses we work with, I think could adopt those strategies. When we realized we were going to be focusing more on testing sales techniques or testing marketing strategies, we found that some of the businesses were just too early stage and that they're still trying to figure out their product market fit, and they don't really know what their messaging should be yet, and so in that case it was like throwing another level of something for them to measure when we would try and test one thing and then they would pivot because of business decisions, and something we had to pivot our strategy. So that's kind of the struggle of the business that might be too early stage for the strategies that we were testing. But that's not to say, I think my hope is that in phase 2 we'll be able to figure out more, we'll have more time, so we can figure out strategies that would be better for the newer stage businesses, hopefully, or for B2Bs, which again we really struggled with. Most of the solutions we were able to come up with were really better focused for B2C. And I think it just honestly, it's just going to take more time, since B2Bs are really kind of like one level. If we're getting out of the HR world, they're kind of one level removed from the end user. So we just need to get a little more creative and spend a little more time thinking about that than we did this pilot. So I'm optimistic that we'll be able to do that, but we didn't have the bandwidth or the time for this pilot.
Sure. Thanks. Sure. Tom, on the
I might address two questions. One about the early one about middle of impact. I guess one thing I would say is that there's in all of these solutions or all of these steps to take practical steps is that there's different needs, different solutions to those needs. There's no silver bullet. So you often have to do many things. So even if something has, for example, medium impact, it's always to be considered. As far as bundling of financing, we've also taken other approaches, one of which we're working with a Shell subsidiary in Nigeria called All On, and we're working to fund enterprises where with 50% grant funding and 50% essentially low or no interest loans from All On. We teamed up with them. We haven't announced it yet, but really starting that in January, doing 10 enterprises in Nigeria in that way. Just a different type of bundled financing.
I can also add on the financing question. I don't have a solution, but more have heard the challenges. So I've heard a lot of companies, small enterprises say they tried doing the financing themselves, and it's just so much risk for them to take on that they quickly back out of that and say we cannot be, distributing products, at half price and expecting payments because people might not repay. On the flip side, I've also seen where enterprises partnered with microfinance institutions that can be really successful. One example that wasn't so great was the microfinance agents were getting incentive to include the Cookstove in their loans that they were distributing. And in one part it makes sense because the Cookstove saves you on fuel costs, so then you'd be more likely to be able to pay your loan. So that's the idea. So the loan agent was getting the incentive if they pushed the product. Seems like an okay idea, but really it was like forcing people to go further into debt and take on something they didn't want. And the loan agents, it was even getting to the point where they wouldn't give people loans unless they took the cook stove. And so then people were, it looks good for the sales for the company, but the end user is really suffering. So you just have to be careful when you're designing and rolling out those types of packages.
Yeah, it's about finding the right microfinance partner.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, also come across partnership opportunities with those types of MFIs with enterprises, and sometimes it's just not the right fit because, and in this case, it sounds like it became more coercive.
Yeah.
Which is not great for women's empowerment. So looking at what the appropriate, testing out different options until you really find the right one.
Okay.
Yeah, we have one other online question. This is not actually for Stephanie. Perhaps it's from Catherine Giambala, and her question is actually for Tom Coogan. Does USADF have a specific woman-centered funding vehicle besides the Women in Energy Challenge?
No, we don't. We do have Willie Grace Campbell Awards, where these are for more for agricultural groups, women's cooperatives, and women's farmers associations. So we do have a second one. Beyond that, there's no specific women-focused funding vehicle. But we try to target approximately 50% of our funding to women organizations.
Okay, I think we are finishing right on time. If there looks like nobody has any other questions, so thank you so much for coming and joining us. As Ellie said, in this busy holiday season of office parties and shopping, this was a wonderful opportunity to really bring, very different perspectives on the same issue and hear from our panel. And hopefully, as we said, this is an area where we are working and hoping to grow our portfolio of work. So hope to see you again for future discussions. Thanks a lot.
Good. Catherine. Yes. Yeah, no, it's fine. I'm here. I've been here for, I know.